Hey friends, and welcome back to the Untold story, where history whispers and forgotten lives come gently back to life. Tonight, you're not just learning about ancient Rome, you're breathing it in. One cobblestone step, one flicker of oil lamp light, one rustling silk hem at a time. But before we slip into the shadows of the Eternal City, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy slow, immersive journeys through the world as it once was. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It always amazes me to see how many of us are drawn together by the quiet hum of curiosity across time zones and continents. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a soft fan for that steady background lull. Let your eyes grow heavy and your mind go still. Our story, of secrets behind marble walls, of quiet rebellions and invisible lives, begins now. The secret life of Roman women. The sky above Rome is turning the color of pressed grapes, a dusty lavender haze rolling over the tiled rooftops like breath exhaled from centuries long past. Somewhere, a fountain burbles lazily in a courtyard. A flock of doves flutters upward from the forum, startled by the sharp clang of a gate. But here, just beyond the edge of the public noise, in the quiet hallways of a domus, the life of a Roman woman begins, silently, almost unseen. Her name is Livia. You won't find her name carved into monuments or whispered in political gossip. She is not a Vestal virgin, not the wife of an emperor. She is a senator's daughter, a wife, and, if the gods are willing, a mother-to-be. Her world is bounded not by Rome's borders, but by colonnades and silken curtains, by custom and whispered instruction, by the soft hand of her nursemaid and the firmer one of her mother-in-law. Her story does not echo in marble halls, but that does not mean it is not worth telling. When Livia was born, the household slaves whispered her name with equal parts reverence and routine. Another girl, another future wife to be shaped, traded, dressed, and hidden away. Her father, a stern man with furrowed brows and precise togas, held her once. Her mother wept quietly beside the birthing couch, not for sorrow, but from a strange mixture of exhaustion and ancient, inherited fear. For Roman women, birth was always a door, to life or to death. As a child, Livia's world was smaller than that of her brothers. While they chased each other through the peristyle and threw pebbles into the impluvium, she sat with her nurse in the women's quarters, threading tiny beads onto strings or learning to keep her posture straight while balancing a tray. She was taught to speak little, to move quietly, to smile gently. But her eyes, dark and wide, absorbed everything. The way her father's voice changed when guests arrived. The way her mother's jewelry was carefully locked away after Saturnalia. The way the kitchen slaves whispered when the mistress was unwell. She learned to read between gestures, to understand the currents beneath the still surface of her household. At 12, her mother took her aside. The talk was not tender. There were no flowers or metaphors, just truth, laid bare like cold bronze. Soon, a husband would be chosen, one who brought honor, property, or connection. Love was never mentioned. Desire was for men. Obedience, for women. And so it was that on a damp spring morning, Livia stood in a room thick with incense, draped in a saffron veil, her hands trembling within the grip of her betrothed. Marcus, 25, with careful curls and teeth like carved ivory. He smelled of garum and imported wine. He whispered Latin poetry into her ear as if that could smooth the ache of terror blooming in her chest. The wedding feast was loud. Livia sat straight-backed beside her new husband, lifting morsels of roast goose to her lips and swallowing without tasting. The women around her laughed, their teeth stained with berries, their hands glittering with rings. But their eyes, those dark Roman eyes, watched her with something more complicated than joy. Not jealousy, not pity, perhaps remembrance, perhaps resignation. Married life was quiet, not unpleasant. Marcus was not cruel. He allowed her silks, permitted music, gifted her with a small dog that followed her everywhere, its little nails clicking on the marble floors. But she was watched, always watched, by the steward, by the household slaves, by his mother, whose eyes missed nothing, who corrected the tilt of her veil, the order of her offering at the Laurarium, the number of steps she took when exiting the triclinium. Pregnancy came like winter, slow, inevitable, and uncomfortable. The midwife checked her urine each morning. Her meals became a strange parade of boiled cabbage, crushed dates, and hunted barley. At night, she lay awake, one hand on her swelling belly, the other clutching a tiny ivory figurine of Diana, gifted to her by her old nursemaid. It was during these long, candlelit hours that Livia's mind wandered. She thought of other women. The slave girl with the scar on her cheek who sang lullabies to herself in the courtyard. The market fishmonger's wife who cackled with her friends over figures. The Vestal virgin she'd once glimpsed from afar, robed and silent. Were they happy? Free? Trapped in different ways? Livia wrote nothing. Women rarely did. But she remembered. Every glance, every warning, every breath that carried the weight of unspoken rules. She began to teach herself, quietly, how to read her husband's scrolls when no one was watching, how to listen behind closed doors, how to gather the stories of the women who moved through her life like ghosts, each with their own quiet rebellion. One night, as the baby kicked beneath her ribs, she whispered a vow, that she would remember, that she would not be forgotten, that even if the world did not write her story, she would carry it within her like flame cupped against the wind. And so begins the secret life of Roman women, not in temples or triumphs, but in shadows and silence, in the ache of waiting, in the strength of stillness, in the thousands of untold stories like Livia's, buried beneath marble and dust, waiting to be remembered. The days bled together under the soft murmur of Roman life. As dawn split open the velvet of night, the streets of the Subura filled with the clatter of carts, the bark of street vendors, and the occasional laugh of a woman pouring water from an upper window. Beneath the noise, in the stillness of private homes and shaded atriums, the quiet rituals of Roman women unfolded. Rituals passed down not through edicts or schools, but through whispers and repetition, like water flowing into worn grooves of stone. Marcia, now a young woman of 16, had grown more aware of the weight of eyes. The eyes of neighbors watching her hem of her stola as she stepped over puddles. The eyes of slaves noting when she lingered too long at the window. The subtle eyes of her mother, watching and measuring her like a tapestry still on the loom, judging which threads to pull, which to cut, to shape her into a respectable Roman matron. In truth, Marcia had begun to sense that Rome was not merely a city of men, laws, and legions, but a city of endless observation. Every woman lived under the scrutiny of the domus, the household, and beyond that, the residential publica, the ever-churning public life of Rome. Her dowry was being negotiated in the back rooms, somewhere between the price of olive oil and the value of good teeth. She was a currency, but also a mystery. And like many Roman women, Marcia was trained to hold secrets with the precision of a vestal's hand over flame. Her education was not the education of her brother. No debates, no Greek philosophy, no orations in the forum. Hers was an education of gesture and silence, how to respond with a single lifted brow, how to soothe a husband's temper with wine just warm enough to taste like kindness, how to memorize the line of a guest's toga to know their rank before they spoke. Evenings were reserved for the women of the household. In the fading orange light of oil lamps, Marcia sat beside her mother and a circle of female slaves, aunts, and cousins, while wool was spun, gossip stitched into stories, and myth blurred into memory. It was here she learned that women's power in Rome was rarely loud, but it was enduring. Her great-aunt whispered tales of Livia, the wife of Augustus, who said little and yet ruled much from behind her husband's throne. Others spoke of sorceresses near the Tiber, women who knew how to read omens in spilled wine and win back a straying lover with ashes and charms. But not all stories were grand. Some were simply brutal. One woman had her hair cut by her husband in a rage and was forced to parade her shame through the market. Another, suspected of poison, was locked away without trial, her fate sealed by whispers. These were not tales of faraway kingdoms. They were yesterday, they were Rome, and they were warnings. Marcia's own heart, despite all the caution braided into her days, had not remained untouched. There was Gaius, a young patrician who passed by her home each morning with scrolls tucked beneath his arm and a smile half meant for her. They never spoke. Of course they didn't. But his presence lived in her like a pressed flower between pages, delicate, unnecessary, but cherished. She dreamed sometimes, not of rebellion, not even of escape, but of softness, of being seen for herself, not for the lineage she carried or the heirs she might produce. Yet she also feared such dreams. They were not Roman. They did not belong in the cold geometry of mosaics or the measured footsteps of the Senate floor. One evening, a friend of her mother's visited. A woman named Domitia, older, dressed in fine Tyrian purple with a voice like poured honey. She had once been married to a senator and was now widowed, wealthy, and whispered about. She observed Marcia with a gaze that seemed to peel back her skin. "You have a curious mind," she said at last. "Use it quietly. Rome tolerates clever women best when they're clever in secret." Demisha stayed long into the night, sharing scandalous anecdotes veiled as lessons. Marcia listened, eyes wide, sensing a different Rome beneath the one carved in stone and declared in marble inscriptions. This was a city of veils, where what was said was often the opposite of what was meant, and where women, though officially absent from power, moved through corridors of influence like smoke curling under doors. Her own mother did not comment on Demisha's visit, but the next morning, Marcia found a gift waiting at her dressing table, a small polished bronze mirror. Not new. It bore tiny scratches and the initials of a woman long gone. But it was beautiful, and somehow, she knew it was not just for checking her appearance. It was a message. Watch closely. Reflect, but do not reveal. Seasons passed, and the negotiations for her marriage grew closer to conclusion. She was to be wed to Lucius Terentius Varro, a man 15 years her senior, known for his military exploits and meticulous record-keeping. He had a square jaw, a reputation for honor, and a villa with aqueduct-fed gardens. Marcia felt nothing. The wedding preparations turned the house into a flurry of linen and perfume. No one asked if she was pleased. No one ever did. It was not about love. It was about placement, like pieces on a Roman mosaic. Each girl married added to the family's image, its honor, its alliances. Women were not the frame of society, but the careful, colored stones pressed into place. Yet inside her, something stirred. Not rebellion, she was too Roman for that, but resolve. She began to keep a journal. On wax tablets at first, quickly erased. Then on papyrus hidden in a jar beneath the garden's laurel tree. She wrote not only about her days, but about the women she met, the things they said when no men were listening, the small cruelties and greater kindnesses that went unnoticed. She began to chart a Rome that was not made of emperors, but of mothers, midwives, mistresses, and girls like herself. Her wedding approached like a slow-moving fog, inevitable and consuming. But Marcia no longer felt entirely helpless. She had stories now, secrets of others and her own. In a city that worshipped silence from its women, she had discovered the quiet weapon of memory. And somewhere in her thoughts, the voice of Demisha lingered. Use your mind, girl, but use it quietly. In the shadowed atrium of Demisha's home, sunlight filtered through the open oculus like liquid gold, pooling silently on the polished floor of black and white mosaic tiles. The pattern, a dancing bacchanti among grapevines, glimmered in that early light, but no one noticed it. Not the slave girl sweeping quietly near the fountain. Not the boy chasing a hoop down the corridor. And certainly not Demisha herself, who sat beneath the colonnade, fingers gently threading through the silk of her stola as her mind drifted far beyond the marbled confines of her home. Her husband had left at dawn, summoned to the curia once again. There were rumors, there were always rumors, that some senator had insulted another, or that the emperor had issued new taxes on olive groves in Sicilia. Demisha had grown used to this half-life of political proximity, of power brushing so close to her that it left a chill on her skin but never dared to touch her directly. She had long ago accepted the rules. Roman women were expected to manage the household, instruct the servants, raise the children, and remain silent while history was carved into stone by the hands of men. But silence does not mean stillness. As the house began to stir around her, slaves laying out bread and hunted dates, her daughter practicing her lyre, Demisha stood and walked into her husband's tablinum. It was a forbidden place in a sense, the study of a Roman man, filled with scrolls, wax tablets, and busts of ancestors whose names were spoken only during funerals. And yet, every morning, after her husband left, she came here alone. She would not touch the sacred wax of the family seal or the legal scrolls lining the cedar shelves. She came only for the light, the peace, and the one scroll hidden in the back of the third shelf, written by Sulpicia, the elusive poetess of Rome. Demisha's fingers trembled slightly as she unrolled it. Her Latin was flawless, but there was something about Sulpicia's words that went beyond the language. They echoed. They lingered. They sounded like a woman's breath caught between the bars of duty and desire. Love has come at last, Sulpicia wrote, and such love as I would be more ashamed to hide than to reveal. Demisha closed her eyes. Her own love story was not made of such bold declarations. She had been married at 16, just after her first bleeding. Her mother wept, but not from sorrow, from pride. Her husband was 20 years her senior, well respected, and only occasionally cruel. That was enough. She had birthed 2 children, maintained a spotless home, hosted feasts where male guests laughed over her culinary successes as if they were hers alone. even though she had never stepped foot in the kitchen beyond the morning inspection. Still, there were other kinds of love. She loved her son's laughter, sharp as cymbals on festival days. She loved her daughter's quiet resolve and the way she tilted her head while thinking. She loved, too, the secret meetings of her women's circle, 8 of them, from different parts of the city, meeting once a week under the guise of religious devotion to Bona Dea. Together, they spoke of herbs and childbirth, of omens and politics, of pleasures they were never supposed to acknowledge. Together, they learned. That afternoon, after the household meal and the siesta that followed, Demisha left with her litter and 2 guards. She claimed she was visiting her aunt near the Aventine, but the guards knew better. They had orders not to speak of her afternoon outings. The meeting place was a simple domus nestled between 2 noisy insulae. Inside, beneath painted walls of Venus and Flora, the women gathered. One of them brought a physician's scroll on anatomy. Another recited lines from a banned Greek poem. And then there was Unia, always Unia, with her scandalous tales and seditious opinions. Unia had once whispered that women should be allowed to vote. The room had gasped, then laughed, then fell silent. But the idea had stuck, like an ember caught in dry linen. They were noble women, yes, but not entirely safe. Rome had spies everywhere, and some husbands were not as lenient as Demisha's. But the women came anyway. They brought questions, stories, sometimes secrets too heavy to carry alone. One had been forced to abort a 3rd daughter by a husband who craved only sons. Another confessed that she had fallen in love with her Greek tutor and hadn't seen her husband in 2 years. None of them judged. Each story was placed on the mosaic floor like an offering. Demisha never spoke much at these gatherings. She preferred to listen. But that day, she brought something, the scroll of Sulpicia. "Have any of you read this before?" she asked, laying it carefully on the floor. The group circled it like priestesses around a sacred flame. "I thought all her writings were lost," said Aurelia, eyes wide. "Some survived," Demisha replied, "but only in private collections. My husband keeps this one hidden, perhaps because he admires her, or perhaps because he fears her." "Why would he fear her?" Unia asked, voice already rising like thunder on the horizon. "Because she wrote as if she had a soul." Unia grinned. That night, long after the stars had scattered themselves across the Roman sky and the laughter of the women had faded into the clatter of carts, Demisha sat by her daughter's bed. The girl was asleep, her small hand curled beneath her cheek. Demisha leaned in and whispered softly, words she had never dared say aloud before. "You are not a vessel. You are not an offering. You are a mind, a heart, a soul. You are Rome." She kissed her daughter's forehead, then extinguished the lamp. In the quiet of her own room, as the oil lamp burned low, Demisha wrote. She had no papyrus, only wax. Her stylus scratched slow circles, then lines. She did not write for fame, or legacy, or even freedom. She wrote because her soul, like Sulpicia's, needed to breathe. And as the city of Rome murmured in its sleep, its streets still warm from the sun, one Roman woman, nameless in history, vibrant in truth, etched her truth into the silence. By the time Livia turned 14, her father's estate had begun to whisper with unfamiliar voices. Older men, wealthier men, patricians, and senators with salt-streaked hair and sun-darkened brows. They did not speak to her, of course. They never did. But they spoke of her, often in the same room, as though she were a piece of furniture meant to nod or blink as negotiations passed overhead. Marriage was not a question. It was a transaction. And Livia, though educated, bright-eyed, and aware of the quiet power women could wield in the empire, was a coin to be exchanged. Her mother, Octavia, did not soften the reality. "You are fortunate," she said once, as she pinned Livia's hair into a crown of tight braids, her fingers steady with a resigned grace. "Your father is choosing carefully. You could do much worse than Marcus Furius Cotta. He already has a villa on the Appian Way, and no living children." She paused, only a memory of a daughter drowned in childbirth. Livia had wanted to ask what kind of memory that was, to a man who still smiled and poured wine without trembling, but she swallowed the question. Questions were dangerous things. They made men nervous. And nervous men, she had learned, turned cruel. The wedding was arranged within weeks, a modest but formal affair draped in soft whites and saffron veils. Livia was silent through most of it, her face an elegant mask carved from expectation. She did not cry. She did not smile. She walked the prescribed steps, placed her hand where it was required, uttered the sacred words, Ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia. Where you are Gaius, I am Gaia. It was a spell of union, but it rang hollow in the honeyed air of the atrium, echoed only by the clicking of sandals and polite applause. Marcus Furius was 27 years her senior. His breath smelled faintly of myrrh and old olives, and his eyes were kind enough, at least, in public. But within the privacy of their new home, Livia learned quickly that kindness had limits. Her opinions were never solicited. Her desires, unrecorded. She became something ornamental, a vase on the ledge, a fertile field to be sown. Her primary duty, repeated by servants and in-laws alike, was to bear sons. Healthy ones. Strong. Preferably with her husband's heavy brow and olive complexion. That she might have preferred books to babies was not a consideration. That she bled too heavily each month and lay in bed curled like a question mark was seen as weakness, not reality. Still, Livia adapted. That was what Roman women did best: bend, stretch, reweave their identities to survive. She learned the layout of the household quickly, which servants were trustworthy, which corridors allowed her glimpses of the garden without being seen, where the wine was stored and where her husband went when he disappeared for hours at a time. She listened. She watched. And she waited. It was during one of Marcus's long absences that she met Julia. Julia was the daughter of a senator and had been married at 16, only to be widowed 3 years later when her husband was accused of treason and executed. She now lived on the Palatine Hill with her aging mother, attended salons, and wrote poetry that she read aloud in whispers at women's baths. She was sharp-tongued and sweet-eyed, and her laughter was like spilled silver. Their friendship began cautiously, shared glances at the market, a brief conversation at a temple, the exchange of a scroll containing Catullus' softer verses. But soon it blossomed, fed by stolen afternoons and shared secrets. Julia spoke of women's circles, of midwives who practiced medicine in secret, of priestesses who interpreted dreams and called it prophecy. She told Livia that there were women who brewed potions not just for healing but for agency, to delay conception, to sweeten their husband's moods, to alter fate itself. Livia listened, hungry. "I'm not saying it's legal," Julia once whispered, their feet dangling over the Tiber. "I'm saying it's possible." Livia did not reply aloud, but something inside her shifted, like water finding a new channel beneath stone. It was around this time that the villa began to change. Marcus had grown increasingly absent, pulled deeper into political intrigues and late-night dinners with men who wore too much perfume and spoke in riddles. Livia was left alone with her thoughts and the occasional courier. She filled her hours with study, revisiting Virgil, translating small portions of Plato, memorizing medicinal herbs under the guidance of an older Greek servant named Thalaea, who once claimed to have treated the wife of Cicero himself. It was Thalaea who first brought her the root of silphium, an herb rare and forbidden, long sought for its peculiar properties. "They say it grows only in Cyrene," Thalaea murmured as she handed the small bundle wrapped in linen. "But I know a man who knows a sailor." Livia did not ask how much it cost, nor did she ask what it would do. She already knew. Each decision came slowly, but with purpose. A powder mixed with wine here. A subtle comment about her health there. When Marcus returned, she met him with practiced obedience, said little, and smiled often. It was easy. Too easy. And within months, he fell ill. The physicians could not explain it, nor could the household. But Livia knew. She did not weep. She did not panic. She simply waited and watched, and eventually buried her husband with all the appropriate rituals. Widowhood came like a second adolescence. And with it, freedom. Relative freedom, at least, tempered by Rome's ever-watchful eyes, but real nonetheless. She moved back to her family's domus for a time, inherited her husband's estate, and, most importantly, gained the right to manage her own affairs. She was 22, and she was no longer a girl. In Rome, the secret life of a woman was lived in the quiet spaces, between the walls of a villa, in the shared glances at a bathhouse, in the language of flowers left at shrines. Livia had joined the ranks of women who knew the weight of silence and the cost of survival. She wore her mourning veil like armor, and beneath it, a slow smile began to grow. Because now she understood something essential, that power, for women like her, was not granted. It was taken, bit by bit, day by day, in whispered words and unseen acts. And in Rome, the most dangerous women were the ones who smiled sweetly while the world underestimated them. The sun had long slipped behind the terracotta roofs, and Rome, ever hungry, ever shifting, began to settle into its nocturnal rhythms. The streets grew quieter now, not silent, but transformed. Instead of the clang of hammer and coin, the wine-slurred laughter of men returning from the forum, or the coarse shouting of vendors, the city took on a murmur. A soft tapestry of footsteps, whispers, and the occasional rustle of silk skirts brushing the stone roads. And somewhere, beneath the facade of routine, a quiet revolution was simmering, one woven not with swords or edicts, but with words, choices, and courage. A revolution led not by emperors or senators, but by women, hidden in plain sight. Livia, our silent witness to this Rome, had learned to walk a different path through the heart of the empire. No longer merely her husband's adornment, she had found herself among women whose stories were not written in the scrolls but passed from hand to hand, from eye to eye, like smuggled treasures. They met in baths, in quiet courtyards, in back rooms of bakeries, and beneath the mosaic domes of temples dedicated not to Mars or Jupiter, but to Diana and Fortuna, goddesses who knew the burden of womanhood and the weight of secrets. There was Flavia, the widow of a merchant who had traded oil and spices across the Mediterranean. Society had tried to fold her back into silence. Once a husband dies, the city expects his wife to fade. But Flavia had instead picked up the ledgers herself. She now ran his business better than he ever had, though always in the name of her dead husband's nephew. Her home was filled with maps, contracts, and amphorae lined in neat rows like soldiers, each one stamped with her initials in a secret code known only to her circle. There was Calpurnia, whose husband was a legate stationed at the frontier in Britannia. Left behind for years at a time, she hosted gatherings where philosophy and poetry flowed freely. One might think it harmless, ladies quoting Virgil, but beneath the surface, these salons were laboratories of thought, of dissent, of delicate dreams. Here, they could question the old gods, ponder new ideas drifting in from the east, and wonder aloud whether virtue had to come wrapped in silence and shame. And then there was Tullia, the youngest of them, barely more than a girl. Sold into marriage with an older senator when she was just 14, she had learned the art of subversion not from books, but from instinct. She read by moonlight, wrote poems that she buried in the roots of fig trees, and once bribed a slave to carry a letter, carefully inked in Greek, to escape Roman eyes, to another girl across the city. A love letter, of sorts. Dangerous. Tender. Together, these women formed a constellation in the darkened sky of Rome. They didn't wear togas or bear arms, but they resisted in subtler ways, with education, with sisterhood, with secrets kept and shared. Their stories would never be etched in marble, but in the gentle creases of parchment, in embroidered folds of tunics, in lullabies sung to daughters who might one day walk freer than they. Livia, too, had changed. She no longer flinched when her husband raised his voice. She learned to smile with ambiguity, to speak in carefully folded meanings, to write only in erasable charcoal when recording her thoughts. She was, in every way, becoming Roman, not just in title, but in survival. But it wasn't only among the upper classes that this quiet evolution stirred. In the insulae, the crowded tenements where smoke choked the stairwells and 6 families shared a single hearth, women plotted lives just as intricately. They wove each other's hair in the morning and whispered warnings about cruel men and dishonest landlords at night. They carried water, raised children, patched wounds, and grieved stillborns with strength honed like a dagger's edge. They knew herbs that could still a womb or restart a stubborn labor. They knew when to lie to a tax collector, when to pay the baker in secrets rather than coin. They passed down not family crests, but wisdom, where to stand in a riot, how to interpret an august shrug, when a dream meant something more than just a dream. These women, unnamed by history, were the true architects of the empire's undercurrent. Rome moved because they did. Its streets stayed clean because they swept them. Its gods were worshipped because they tended the shrines. Its boys grew into men because they were fed, healed, and loved, if not always well, then with what little could be spared. Yet still, the empire refused to see them. It saw the grain shipments and the gladiators, the treaties and the temples, but not the hands that held it all together. Not the hands that braided bread and braided hair. Not the eyes that saw too much and were told to forget. That invisibility was both curse and camouflage, because within that invisibility lay power. A quiet kind of power. The kind that slips through cracks, that grows like ivy through marble, that survives even when no one remembers to write it down. One evening, as the spring winds began to warm the night, Livia walked alone through the forum, not as a wife, nor as a Roman matron, but as something more primal. something older. She paused by a statue of Minerva, the goddess of wisdom and war, and wondered how many women had stood in that same spot, asking questions they dared not voice. What did freedom look like for a Roman woman? Was it the right to speak in the Senate? To own land in her own name? To walk alone at dusk without glances curling around her like vines? Or was it smaller, softer, the ability to choose her own silences, to keep a diary beneath her mattress, to love whom she loved without shame or fear? No answer came. But in that silence, Livia found something else. Possibility. The labyrinth beneath the Laurel. The heat of the Roman summer pressed down with relentless weight. Violets and oleanders drooped under the strain of a sun that refused to retreat, and the city's stone structures absorbed the heat like memory, releasing it slowly, long after dusk. In this heavy stillness, voices softened, feet moved slower, and thoughts turned inward. It was in this silence, beneath the surface of the daily pageant, that Emilia began to slip further into the quiet spaces Roman women inhabited beyond their assigned roles. Her letters to Livia had grown more coded, written now in a blend of casual commentary and veiled poetry. The stylist danced with calculated elegance across wax tablets, each message smuggled through the backhand of a house slave or, occasionally, through the merchant woman who sold spices and silks near the Temple of Vesta. Trust became a form of currency rarer than gold. The wrong word could collapse not only Emilia's life, but Livia's too, and the lives of all who listened behind closed curtains and beneath vaulted cellars. And yet, despite the risks, the web was growing. One evening, as a crimson veil of twilight fell across the rooftops, Emilia made her way into the Subura again, not to meet with Livia this time, but to listen. In the dim interior of a midwife's dwelling, surrounded by the damp scent of herbs and warm loaves, she met women who whispered stories of miscarriages blamed on the evil eye, of husbands who struck them beneath the silence of domestic sanctity, and of moments of defiance where remedies were passed from palm to palm like forbidden scriptures. An older woman, stooped and robed in a faded green shawl, told a tale of slipping mandrake root into the wine of a violent lover, of finding a way, if not to leave, then at least to quiet his fists for a night. Another, with a woven basket of dried figs on her lap, recounted how she had faked madness to escape marriage to a man 3 decades her senior, hiding for months in a distant cousin's house by the Tiber. Their stories were not noble nor heroic in the Roman sense. They were too quiet, too shadowed. But they were real. And to Emilia, they shimmered with a new kind of power. At home, she began leaving the women's quarters more frequently, not with flamboyant rebellion, but with calm, calculated ease. She volunteered more often at the family shrine, citing piety as a shield, and gained access to records and scrolls in the atrium. She took notice of which male relatives retired early from the day's business, which ones lingered over wine, and which ones were too proud to notice when the women slipped out the side door. It was in this newly carved space that she uncovered something unexpected, a letter, unfinished, tucked behind a half-burnt scroll in the family library. The writing was a mother's, the wax faded, the Latin formal and clipped. It was a plea to a woman named Calpurnia, one she had never heard spoken of. The letter hinted at debts, at secrets, at the dangers of having known too much and spoken too freely. For the first time, Emilia wondered not just who her mother had been as a wife and mother, but who she had been as a woman, with fears and alliances, hopes and calculations. And suddenly, the line between her own life and the generations that came before began to blur. The ink of her mother's hand felt as fresh as her own. The weight of legacy, of lives unspoken and hidden, pressed upon her, not as a burden, but as a strange and intimate inheritance. Around the same time, Livia introduced her to a new circle. These were not women from the Subura or the market stalls, but wives of senators, sisters of military commanders, daughters of scribes. Cloaked in wealth and adorned with amulets of amber and lapis lazuli, they moved like chess pieces across the city's noble gatherings, listening and nodding in perfect rhythm with the expectations of Roman decorum. But beneath their carefully orchestrated grace, they too were watching, memorizing, exchanging knowledge under the guise of social niceties. From them, Emilia learned how information was traded like silk, how a knowing glance at a banquet could mean more than a full scroll of words, how a perfume swapped at the baths carried a message, how certain fruits left on doorsteps carried subtle warnings. The conspiracy of silence became its own language. Emilia's father remained largely oblivious. In the wake of political distractions and family obligations, he welcomed her newfound piety and discretion, never once suspecting that beneath her calm demeanor and ceremonial modesty lay a life spiraling ever deeper into the city's hidden veins. She began copying herbal formulas in a secret codex sewn into the hem of her tunic. recipes for soothing pain, for stopping unwanted pregnancies, for sleep, for waking. She etched notes in wax that vanished with the sun. The women's meetings became more structured, rotating locations, codes of entry, layered silence. And then came the fire. It started in a tenement a few blocks north of the Forum, perhaps from a cooking flame, or perhaps from something more sinister. But within hours, the inferno swept through the lower quarters like a god unshackled. Ash blanketed the city. Soot clung to marble statues like mourning cloth. People screamed through the streets. Wealthy men blamed the plebeians. The plebeians blamed the gods. And in the chaos, the women moved. They pulled scrolls from hiding places. They shifted herbs and salves into new baskets. They opened cellars and temple basements. As the city's order crumbled temporarily beneath the weight of disaster, the hidden architecture of female resilience came fully alive. It was Livia who guided Emilia through the smoke-choked alleyways that night. Not to flee, but to retrieve a girl, barely 13, who had been promised in marriage to a man who owned most of the leather tanneries in the district. He had lost his property in the fire. She, apparently, had lost her value. But to the women, she was not a transaction. She was a life to be saved. When they returned to Livia's sanctuary, a low, domed house beneath an ivy-covered atrium, they washed the ash from their arms and watched the flames dance on the horizon like red-tinged ghosts of old emperors. And in that moment, as night cooled and the city cried, Emilia felt something within her solidify, not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of memory. A vow to the women who had hidden, whispered, healed, plotted, and endured. To those who carved lives from the cracks and shadows. The fire would be remembered in the official records as a tragedy. Losses would be counted in coin and columns. But in the margins, where the ashes of scrolls mingled with the sweat of women who had carried generations of silence, something else had begun. Not a revolution, but a rebirth. The sun had barely risen above the tiled rooftops of Rome when Julia was shaken from her sleep by the creak of a door and the soft whisper of slippers on stone. It was a mother, her face etched with the worry of sleepless nights, standing in the doorway like a statue sculpted from concern. Without a word, she beckoned Julia to rise, to follow her down the mosaic-lined hallway to a room rarely opened, her father's study. The scent of old papyrus and olive oil lingered in the air like a memory trapped in time. Scrolls lined the walls, each one sealed and labeled, untouched since the old senator's last political campaign. But it was not the politics of men that had brought Julia to this place. It was a woman's silence that needed breaking. Her mother, Livia, reached for a carved wooden box nestled between two dusty scrolls. Inside were folded pieces of parchment, letters sealed with a faded insignia, and a single strand of red thread. With trembling hands, she held the thread to the morning light, and Julia watched as it glimmered faintly, as if trying to recall its former brilliance. "This," Livia whispered, "was passed to me by my mother, and her mother before that. It is not gold or silver we treasure, but the stories no one else is allowed to tell. This thread, this color, was once worn by the priestesses of Vesta." Julia's heart quickened. The Vestals, keepers of Rome's sacred flame, sworn virgins of the state, protectors of the city's divine favor. And yet, even they, with their exalted position, had their secrets. Livia's voice lowered. "One of our ancestors broke her vow. She fell in love with a man who recited poetry by the Tiber, who fed birds from his hand and kissed her fingers as if they were blessings. She was discovered and buried alive, but she had already conceived a child." Julia could hardly breathe. The woman in the story, her blood, her lineage, was a crime against the gods. Or at least that's how Rome would have seen it. Yet in her veins flowed the legacy of a woman who had dared to love. That morning, something shifted in Julia. The fear that had once kept her bound began to crack. Not because the world outside had changed, but because now she could see how many had suffered in silence before her. She understood now that womanhood in Rome was not a series of roles handed down by men, but a quiet rebellion, encoded in lullabies and recipes and hushed warnings passed at twilight. Later that week, Julia found herself walking the markets with her cousin Cornelia, who had just returned from Hispania. Cornelia was everything she was not: bold, unmarried, loud with her laughter and proud of the spice in her tongue. The traders addressed her like an equal, and she responded like a queen. When Julia asked her how she managed such freedom, Cornelia smiled and held up her hands. "These," she laughed, "these are stained with ink and citrus. I write for the governor's wife. I compose letters for her to send to her husband's rivals, dripping with sarcasm." and they think she's just witty. You ghostwrite for noble women. I ghost live for them, cousin. While they sit in silence, I give voice to their grudges, their dreams, their wit. It wasn't what Julia had expected to hear, but it made sense. Even under the weight of patriarchy, Roman women had found ways to exist between the lines. As mourners, poets, midwives, and matchmakers, they thrived not by challenging Rome directly, but by mastering the labyrinth beneath its marble foundations. Back at home, Julia began to notice more. Her father's slaves weren't just tools, they were people with entire histories. Her brother's wife, silent at dinner, was fluent in 3 languages and copied legal codes for a jurist who paid in bracelets. The woman who brought their bread each morning wore the sigil of an illegal cult around her neck, shaped like a fish. And then there was the girl, Amara, the former slave her father had purchased and freed when she was just 15. Amara had remained, working as a servant, but she carried herself with a quiet dignity that seemed to make everyone else uncomfortable. One evening, when the household had gone to bed, Julia found her in the garden, praying not to Juno or Minerva, but to a nameless god of light she called simply Hope. "What are you praying for?" Julia asked, leaning against a fig tree. Amara didn't look up. That one day, women won't need to pray in secret. It was a strange answer, but something in it resonated like the low hum of an underground spring. Julia began writing. Not the elegant verse taught in school, but truths. Pages filled with observations, overheard gossip, encoded messages from conversations in kitchens and bathhouses. She created a system of symbols, borrowed from weaving patterns and the constellations, to protect her work. She hid the pages in the base of a broken amphora in the garden wall. Her journal grew. In it, she catalogued the rituals of childbirth, the herbs used to encourage or delay conception, the secret names passed from grandmothers to daughters. She documented the smiles shared between women whose husbands treated them like livestock, the silent exchanges in the forum between women of different classes who had learned how to communicate without a word. But it wasn't just her writing that changed. It was her gaze. Julia began to see every woman in Rome not as a background figure in a male epic, but as a chapter in a larger, hidden saga. Even the statues began to speak to her. She would walk the forum and stop beneath the likeness of Livia Drusilla, Augustus' wife, and imagine her private thoughts as she maneuvered the politics of a city built for men. She would stare into the vacant eyes of marble matrons and wonder, what secrets did they carry into eternity? By the time the Feast of Fortune arrived, the goddess of fate and fortune, Julia was no longer the same girl who had once feared marriage like a cage. She still feared it, but now she feared more what would happen if she said nothing, if no one said anything. And so, beneath the clamor of celebration, the music and incense, the clatter of sandals on stones, she passed her first copy of the hidden journal to a widow who ran a fabric shop near the Tiber. The woman didn't speak. She only nodded and tucked the parchment into the folds of her sleeve. It was done. The network had begun. And somewhere, far from the temples and senates, beneath the very foundations of Rome, a whisper began to grow. A whisper that carried the memories of those who were never supposed to speak, but always did. By the time twilight wrapped its cool fingers around the city, cloaking tiled roofs and statues in violet haze, something had shifted in Valyria. The world she had lived in all her life, a mosaic of duties, glances, and quiet endurance, was still there. But now, she could see the thin lines of tension within it. She saw them in the careful pauses between her mother's instructions, in the unreadable eyes of her father's clients, and even in the way the slaves exchanged glances when they thought no one watched. That night, her dreams bled with colors she couldn't name. Fields of olive trees under silver skies. A girl running barefoot across marble steps, chasing nothing but wind. Voices whispering through corridors. Voices that had always been there, but now, for the first time, she could understand. When she awoke, it was with a strange determination. She would go to Cassia. Cassia, the midwife who saw everything and told no one. The woman who had once held Valyria's hand as a child when her sister had died of fever. The one who wore the silver serpent pin that Valyria now knew meant more than just adornment. She waited until the household stilled for afternoon rest, until her mother was asleep in the shade and her father had left to visit the bathhouse. Slipping on a plain tunic and drawing a worn shawl over her hair, Valyria stepped into the street alone for the first time in her life. Rome in the midday heat was a living beast. Vendors shouted through their teeth, dogs barked from shaded corners, and children darted like fish through alleys. The sun painted every stone with fire. Cassia's home was not far, wedged between a bakery and a potter's shop, but Valeria took the long way. She walked slowly, letting herself listen. Every voice she passed felt like part of a secret conversation. A woman begging the gods for fertility. A man shouting about taxes. A soldier arguing with his lover over betrayal. Lives layered and layered, nothing like the clean, orderly image she had been raised to believe in. When she knocked on Cassia's door, her hand trembled. Cassia opened it without surprise, as if she'd been expecting her. "You came," she said simply, stepping aside to let her in. The air inside was cool and scented with herbs. Jars lined the shelves, roots, powders, dried flowers. On a low table sat a statue of Diana, goddess of the moon and of women, her face stern and soft all at once. "I need to understand," Valeria said, barely able to keep her voice from breaking. "I need to know what I am." Cassia stuttered her. "You're a woman. That alone is more dangerous and powerful than they let you believe." Valeria shook her head. "Not just that. I've seen things. Felt. Things. I know about the rites. About the ones who gather under the full moon. About what my mother never said." Cassia motioned for her to sit. She poured wine into 2 small cups, added a sprig of something pungent, and handed one to Valeria. The liquid was warm, laced with bitterness. "There are women in this city," Cassia began, "who know how to birth children and ease pain. Who know when the moon calls the tides in not just water, but blood. Who remember the names of herbs that men forget, because they never had to bleed or break or burn quietly." She paused. "We remember. That's what makes us dangerous." Valeria felt tears slip down her cheek. She didn't even try to wipe them away. "You are not crazy, child," Cassia said softly. "You are awakening." For the next hour, or maybe it was days, they talked. About the old goddesses. About how certain knowledge had been driven underground but never lost. About how Roman women kept traditions alive not by shouting but by weaving them into lullabies, recipes, and funerary rites. About how even in a world of marble, a whisper could outlast a monument. Valeria left Cassia's home with a pouch of herbs tied to her waist, and a word pressed into her palm like a secret: fidelitas. Loyalty, not to the state or to the empire, but to those who walked before and those who would come after. That night, she didn't return home. Instead, she wandered until the city fell quiet. She found herself at the Tiber, where the water glowed with moonlight. A group of women stood barefoot at the edge, singing something ancient and slow. She joined them, silently. They didn't ask her name. One of them took her hand and pressed a mark of ash onto her forehead. She had crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed. From that point on, Valeria learned the city again, this time through the eyes of the invisible. She learned which wells were blessed, which alleyways echoed with truth, which temples turned a blind eye to women's prayers, and which listened even when the gods had turned their backs. She met women from all strata, slaves who carried knowledge in their calloused hands, patricians who wrote spells and poetry, vestals who whispered prayers in a dead language. They formed a quiet network. Not rebels, not witches, not even enemies of Rome. Just women who remembered. And remembering, as Valeria now understood, was its own form of resistance. There was power in the mundane, in the everyday acts no one noticed. The way a woman laid a cloth over a child's crib, the way she stirred oil with her finger clockwise, murmuring a name, the way she picked pomegranate seeds, 3 at a time, and dropped them into wine. Rome thought it ruled with swords and laws. But Valeria now knew the truth. It was women, watchful, quiet, resilient, who held the pulse of the empire between their fingers. In the twilight of Rome's waning golden age, silence had a different kind of power. It wasn't just the hush between conversations or the lull between Senate sessions. It was the kind of silence that pulled like ink between the stones of old courtyards and whispered in the ears of women too long denied the space to speak. It lingered in the crevices of cracked marble statues, curled up in the folds of discarded stolae, and hung in the air above every woman who had ever been told her story was not worth recording. But silence, as history would learn too late, is rarely empty. And so we return, this time not to the palaces or baths, not to the chatter of dinner parties or the low mutter of the basilica, but to a quieter place. A garden, a neglected villa, a woman. Her name was Livia, not the empress, but a freedwoman who had once belonged to the house of a minor senator. She lived on the outskirts of Aventine Hill, in a crumbling estate left to her by a mistress who had died childless. No scrolls bore Livia's full tale. No statues were carved in her name. But what she carried, in the gentle tilt of her head when the wind stirred the olive trees, in the calloused fingertips that once stitched tunics for women far more visible, was a lifetime of secrets. In her home, walls were papered not with frescoes but with memory. Here, under the softened hush of late afternoon sun, Livia had hosted quiet gatherings for other women like herself. Widows, daughters, slaves now free or still bound. Together they formed a council of the forgotten, a senate of sandals and soft laughter, of borrowed poetry and whispered advice passed from one hand to the next like smuggled fruit. There were no records of these meetings. That was the point. History, as Rome kept it, was a man's ledger. Yet the lives of Roman women unfolded in the margins, in glances exchanged in the market, in coded songs sung while weaving, in the secret knowledge of herbs passed down from mother to daughter, even in the rhythm of broom bristles swept across mosaic floors. Livia's gatherings were never political in the way Rome measured politics, but they were revolutionary. These women discussed midwives and miscarriage, but also currency shortages, unfair grain taxes, and which senator's new wife was quietly working to free her household slaves. They translated the news, the kind of news not spoken aloud, into action, hiding a girl who had fled an abusive master, sharing bread when a widow's pension ran dry, carrying herbs to ease childbirth when temples denied aid. And above all, they preserved something Rome never intended them to: memory. Livia had a habit of tracing her finger along the lines of a palm, murmuring the names of women she had known. Not famous ones, but essential ones. Unia, who could heal a fever with a leaf and a prayer. Flavia, who wrote poetry under the name of her brother. Maya, who gave birth in silence in a temple stairwell and survived. Names not found in scrolls, but carved deep in the soft places of memory. By the time she was old, Livia had long outlived her former master. The estate had grown wild, its garden filled with thyme and ivy, and children from neighboring homes claimed it was haunted, not by ghosts, but by the sound of women laughing in the dark. In truth, it was still alive. Each season, new women came. Some pregnant, some frightened, some bruised, some burning with a fire too dangerous to speak aloud in the forum. And each time, Livia welcomed them not with rhetoric, but with a bowl of dates and a place to sit. She taught them to read each other's eyes, not the laws written by men. To hold space for one another, not just in rooms, but in the living record of each other's lives. One evening, during the festival of Bona Dea, the one time each year when men were strictly forbidden from entering the rites, a young girl named Tasha asked Livia if the goddess ever truly listened. Livia's reply was simple: "Only when we speak in a voice we believe is worth hearing." That night, the women lit no fire. They sat under the stars and recited verses that had never seen ink, passed like song from mouth to mouth, stories of love with no dowries, of hunger met with shared spoons, of silent resistance forged not with blades but with care. In that moment, history forgot them again. But memory did not. For the world outside was changing. Rome's borders were fraying. The emperors were growing more paranoid. Bread was more expensive. And yet, the women gathered. This time, older Livia did not lead them. Her chair remained empty beneath the apricot tree. But in her absence, no silence grew. Only presence. Tasha took her place, gently unfolding a cloth bundle filled with Livia's letters, written not in Latin, but in an old Etruscan tongue, hidden from her household for years. They weren't meant for historians. They were meant for those still waiting to be heard. By the time the eternal city began to forget itself, the women remembered everything. Rome had grown tired. Tired of its own cruelty, tired of its emperor's indulgences, tired of fighting wars it no longer understood. The gold that once shimmered in the sun like a promise was now dulled with dust and desperation. The temples still stood, but their steps were cracked, their priests fewer. The Senate still argued, but no longer about the soul of the Republic, only about which rich man would bleed less from the taxes. And all the while, beneath the cobblestones, in kitchens and shrines, the women waited. Not passively. They had been watching for centuries, learning to bend without breaking, hiding scrolls in bundles of laundry, saving the names of the dead in lullabies, sharing stories when the men weren't listening. They didn't need a revolution. They were the revolution. Quiet, enduring, unwritten. It was in these final days of empire that a young woman named Cassia rose to quiet prominence. She was no senator's daughter. Her father had been a scribe for an equestrian family, and her mother a laundress whose hands were forever cracked by lye and soap. But Cassia had grown up amidst ink stains and whispered news, learning to read both scroll and silence with equal fluency. By 20, she knew how to forge signatures better than the consuls knew how to write their own. By 25, she had become invisible to the men around her, an unremarkable matron, with graying braids and soft-spoken manner. Just the way she needed to be. Cassia didn't lead an army. She led a library. Hidden deep within the crumbling substructure of a disused bathhouse near the Esquiline Hill, Cassia and a handful of other women had spent the better part of 2 decades collecting everything Rome tried to forget. Letters, recipes, midwifery notes, dreams, testimonies from girls who had survived brothels and boys raised by their mothers in secret, charms scratched into pottery shards, spells, prayers, names. They called it the Atrium Silentium, the Hall of Silence, a place where nothing was truly silent. Every inch of wall had been written on, painted over with crushed charcoal and ash. No statues stood, no busts of emperors or warriors. Instead, there were cloth dolls and dried bundles of herbs, a cracked mirror, a child's sandal, an offering bowl. The women who visited came barefoot, sometimes hooded, sometimes trembling. Many were enslaved or recently freed. Others were rich women married into political families who could not breathe in their own homes. One had been a Vestal virgin, cast out for a crime she never committed. She carried with her a handful of temple ash and a secret vow. In the Atrium Silentium, stories were not judged. They were simply heard. Cassia began recording these stories, not in Latin, but in a script she had invented, one no man could read. A language built from fragments of Etruscan, Greek, and dreams. She trained others in it, whispered it into their ears while combing their hair, inked it into the hems of their tunics. It was, in essence, a language of survival. Outside, Rome cracked further. The northern borders collapsed. Vandals sacked the cities. Senators fled to villas in the countryside. Gold disappeared. Grain shipments dwindled. Fires spread unchecked. And yet, in the atrium, the women kept writing. They wrote because no one else would. They wrote about mothers who saved their daughters from arranged marriages by pretending madness. About old slaves who buried amulets under doorways to protect the unborn. About bakers' wives who disguised rebel messages as recipes. About love between women hidden behind temple rituals. About grief that stretched for decades after miscarriages. About gods that no longer answered and new ones found in the faces of strangers. The empire may have fallen, but the stories did not. When Cassia grew old, she no longer wrote. She listened. She taught a girl named Junilla how to mix ink from soot and oil, how to wrap scrolls so they wouldn't rot in damp seasons. She gave her the key, not made of bronze, but a word only spoken once, in a hush so sacred the stones seemed to listen. And then she disappeared. Some said Cassia died. Others claimed she simply walked out of the city gates on a spring morning and was never seen again. Junilla never told. But what followed was remarkable. The stories continued, long after the empire did not. Years later, when a Christian monk stumbled across the remnants of the bathhouse, by then mostly rubble and moss, he uncovered strange symbols painted beneath layers of soot. He dismissed them as pagan nonsense and sealed the chamber. But others remembered. Women whose grandmothers had once passed them songs in coded rhymes. Midwives who knew charms that had no known origin. Daughters who had always felt as if someone had spoken their name centuries before they were born. And somewhere in the hills outside Rome, long past the time when Caesar's name meant anything at all, a young girl sat beneath an olive tree with a scroll wrapped in oilcloth. She could not read Latin, but she understood what was written. Her fingers moved gently across the ink symbols, as if the letters were breathing. She was not alone. All around the Mediterranean, in Alexandria, in Carthage, in Delphi and Gaul, similar stories had taken root. Women who had read the words passed them on in gestures and lullabies. Mothers humming ancient names. Sisters who refused to marry. Herbalists who healed without temples. Widows who carved signs into bread crusts before feeding the hungry. The empire had ended. The maps had changed. The statues had fallen. But in kitchens and in dreams, Rome still breathed. Not the Rome of conquest or cruelty, of Senate decrees and sword-polished boots, but the Rome built quietly by hands that stitched and soothed and remembered. That Rome was never silent, because in the end, The secret life of Roman women wasn't just in the things they endured. It was in the stories they passed on when no one else thought to listen. It was in their refusal to forget each other, in the quiet defiance of living fully in a world that never intended them to. And tonight, as you drift gently into sleep, remember, empires may crumble, scrolls may burn, names may be lost, but stories whispered in love, in resistance, in truth, those are eternal. Just like Rome, just like them, just like you.